This is ZOWIE's brand new line of gaming mice called Divina, and currently includes both the Ergonomic EC1-B and new ambidextrous S1 and 2. All four mice are available to buy in glossy pink or blue, and as somebody that doesn't tend to get sweaty palms during the longest of gaming sessions, is a coating I personally prefer for a more secure grip, particularly on the larger of mice. If you are somebody that does sweat however, then do consider sticking with the usual black matte or rubber finishes, as otherwise you might find them to be too slippery on lift. The ZOWIE EC1-B is large in size and is designed for right-handed ergonomic users to palm grip, and with two left side buttons it comes in at a length of 128mm, a height of 43 and a width at the grip position of approximately 64, additionally weighing in at roughly 98 grams with some cable, whilst the EC2 is medium in size and is designed for palm or claw grip, bringing that length down to 120, height to 40 and the width to 61, also with a weight reduction to around 90 grams. The common preconception is that the EC1 should serve as the alternative to the Razer DeathAdder. However, now having both models in hand, I'd have to respectfully disagree, and instead suggest it's the EC2. Its little brother feels almost identical to my DeathAdder's grip width of roughly 62, and the EC1 definitely filled my palm a little more to the point that it was noticeable. Now my hands are roughly 19 by 10, and if you've got that or smaller, you really ought to opt for the EC2, whilst those with larger or just those with abnormally long ring fingers might do well to consider the EC1 instead. With that said, I could still see myself competing with either size, and that's considering the back slopes are not overly aggressive toward their highest point, like on something such as the G403, i.e. vertical movements in-game on the EC1 were still a non-issue for me. Now build quality is excellent on both the 1 and 2 as well, with good weight distribution and balance when lifting. My two samples have zero rattle, and I couldn't activate either side button while squeezing the mouse with the power of thought either, but in reference to those buttons, they could be slightly wider to allow for easier rolling of the thumb to activate, and certainly a little less mushy following the actuation point despite being tactile. But both are things I wouldn't dwell on too much, and you'll adapt just fine. They were great for Fortnite building, I had no issues. Now the mouse wheel features a 16-step optical encoder as opposed to a 24 like on some other mice. This does mean there is a little extra distance to hit each notch while scrolling forward and back, but it's been just fine for me both in-game and out, and to be honest I kinda like the extra feedback it offers, and that's despite not having a problem with the usual 24 step on my other mice. And finally, despite the primary buttons being a part of the top shell, the force required to actuate them remains consistent right the way up to the top of the shell. They're Huano switches and are not too light nor too heavy, and so offer a pretty safe and tactile middle ground to which I can't imagine anyone would complain. But if you're interested, here is the listen to the clicks. The ZOWIE S1 meanwhile is medium in size and designed for right-handed ambidextrous users to palm or claw grip. It's ZOWIE's first ambidextrous mouse with side buttons on the left only, and comes in at a length of 126mm, a height of 39 and a width at the grip position of approximately 61, weighing in at roughly 92 grams with some cable. Its little sister, the S2, is smaller in size and designed for claw or fingertip grip, bringing that length down to 122, height to 38 and width at the grip position to 59, with a weight reduction to around 86 grams. Now in terms of sizing, I found the S1 to be an appropriate fit for me, which is also designated as a medium mouse on the ZOWIE website, like the EC2 that I've chosen. Now I haven't had the chance to use the FK and ZA shapes, but I have to say this S1 is extremely comfortable in that respect, and I think you'd struggle to find somebody that would dislike it, given there's no inward curve that one might consider to be overly aggressive for their pinky finger when palming on the right. That said, as per almost every other ambidextrous shape out there, that curve is still there, it's just simply subtle enough to avoid being bothersome, at least in my opinion. Now normally I'd go on to suggest the back slopes way too aggressively toward its highest point on the back as well, but considering the mouse is shorter than its alternatives, and that's by design, it definitely gets away with it, and it didn't find it impacted my vertical movement whatsoever. Build quality is again excellent on the S series, with equally great weight distribution and balance, and they've also made some pretty significant improvements to the side buttons when compared to the EC series, in as much as you can now easily roll your thumb to actuate, plus they have little to no travel afterwards. All of my thoughts on the mouse wheel and buttons though are echoed here as well, and here's a listen if you're interested. All 4 Divina mice are completely driverless and thus free of additional software. They feature the PMW3360 sensor with max tracking speeds of up to 7 meters per second, with buttons underneath that will toggle DPI between 400, 800, 1600 and 3200. The first 3 will have no discernible smoothing either, as they're below 2K, meaning they'll be immediately responsive and perfect for tracking enemy model directional changes. Polling rate can also be set to 125, 500 and 1000 Hz, plus liftoff distance is also customizable when plugging in, which we'll look at shortly. So as we move into our gameplay testing, I want to point out I have tested all 4 mice and essentially they performed equally across the board. But for the purpose of this segment, we are just going to be using the EC2-B in the interest of keeping things as short as possible. But for our first test, we're confirming a lack of mouse acceleration inherent to ZOWIE's implementation of the PMW3360. Acceleration can of course be useful, but only when it's added by the player in-game afterwards, and not when it's inherent or built into the sensor for those that don't want it. As expected, no matter how slow or fast we move any of the mice from the left to the right of our GSRSE pad, it always ends up in the same place. And all 4 mice are also impossible to make malfunction thanks to crazy fast max tracking speeds offered by the sensor. Now in terms of button latency, whilst using my scientifically inaccurate but still relevant bump test considering it takes into account the shell for real world use, the ZOWIE mice come in close enough to my Logitech G Pro, which is one of the fastest mice available on the market, thus it won't cause any issues in game, and it's going to allow you to feel comfortable and confident when holding angles in games like Counter-Strike. This of course leads us nicely into our button debounce test, where we can see there are no issues with executing mini jumps in Shoot Mania. An otherwise too high of a debounce time would make our smallest jump a medium-sized jump, and this is because the button wouldn't have been released quick enough and also before a second could be activated. This also means there are no issues with full height rocket jumps in Quake because both mouse 1 and mouse 2 can be pushed down simultaneously without delay, and again the same across the entire EC and S range. And finally, there are 3 liftoff distance settings on the mice: low, medium and high, and you can skip through these using various button combinations when initially plugging in the mouse. Liftoff distance will be slightly different based on the pad you're using, which I have to point out, but just know even on the highest liftoff distance setting, on the GSR SE, it's below 2 DVDs, aka 2.4mm. The lowest setting is below 1, aka 1.2, and the medium setting is somewhere between the 2, which is what I've chose to leave it on. So then, final thoughts on the ZOWIE Divina line and my experience gaming on the EC2-B. Well, as most of you know, I've been a DeathAdder user since the original Microsoft IntelliMouse 3.0 was discontinued. I actually started reviewing mice to find something new around about the time the 2013 was released, and that's not because the mouse before that underperformed, because it's been fantastic, but simply because I've been curious. However, nothing has really matched the personal comfort level of those 2 shapes for me, and especially in today's mouse market, comfort and, well, potentially buttons I guess, are really the only 2 factors that will separate competitor A from B, and this is large in part thanks to the PMW3366 sensor that inevitably gave rise to the 3360 in this line and 3389 in my DeathAdder Elite. And as for the alternatives, the rival has typically felt a little cheap, and the Gladius has always been too heavy for me. Honestly, the MM531 is probably the only mouse that's taken me away from the DeathAdder for an extended period of time. But I ultimately went back, and I suppose I've always hoped for a Logitech competitor as well, but maybe that shapes for another year. Meanwhile, ZOWIE's EC Series has been on the market for what feels like forever at this point, and I'm really struggling to come up with a viable reason as to why I've never given it a proper shot. The only real negative I can find today is that you pay a premium price for what you might consider to be a product that has less features than its competition, but only when it comes to software and lighting, and I can't help but think I've been somewhat an idiot in this regard. Especially as first and foremost, I'm a competitive player. But I know immediately out of the box the EC2 would be my weapon of choice, and I really ought to give praise to ZOWIE design philosophy here. They continue to offer multiple shapes and sizes, and each feature near identical internals, resulting in mice that will fit most players. I only wish I'd bothered to try it sooner in that respect, because the subtle size and weight differences to my DeathAdder, coupled with an equally responsive sensor and buttons, in combination with hassle-free setup, has made for an excellent gaming experience at every step so far. Perhaps I could have avoided years of reviews, but hey, I'm sure it's been appreciated. That's not to say the EC and S series can't be improved in future iterations though, or that it couldn't still benefit from optional software that might offer, for example, finer control over DPI settings. performance. I'd personally love to see the implementation of a shoelace cable, for example, like on the DM1 FPS that I reviewed recently too. But if you do buy today, then providing you have space above your pad, a mouse bungee, or some sticky tape, you'll find you get on just fine with the included non-braided one as well, as there's really no problem with it. What I do want to say though is you should keep your eyes peeled to the ZOWIE Twitter and Facebook for where their experience booths are going to be next for a hands-on demonstration of their mice, because I'd say that's the only real disadvantage to buying one online. Sometimes there is such a thing as too much choice, and you've really got to make a best guess on which size will fit your hand, as my suggestions will only get you so far. But don't get me wrong, there's only one size of DeathAdder, and that certainly isn't for everybody either. If you do, like me, pick up an EC2-B and aren't fortunate enough to try an EC1-B, you're always going to wonder, would that have been better, or vice versa. In other words, I'm simply nitpicking, and all I can say with certainty is that I'm sticking with my EC2-B after 10 years of using a DeathAdder, so take that as you will. So just before we close off, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Esports Gear. They were handpicked by ZOWIE to be the exclusive UK Special Edition product partner, and were gracious enough to ship free samples of the black EC2-B and special edition red GSR SE for me to review. Just days later, ZOWIE then went on to ship all of this Divina line, so that video kind of went through the window. But the only difference between the EC2-B black and the Divina edition is its glossy coating and return of large mouse feet. Otherwise, the two products appear to be identical, and to me, the decision between both should be entirely personal preference based on colour and coating. You can check them out at esportsgear.uk, and they're active on Twitter if you have any questions. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and enable notifications. If you have any questions or comments, then let me know down below and I'll get back to you. But otherwise, for now, take care, keep gaming, and I'll see you in the next video.